Welcome to the last installment of the Value Added Product webinar series. My name's Grace Perry and I work for Community Alliance with Family Farmers, and I'm going to start us off today. This series started about 2 weeks ago and concludes today. During the past couple of weeks, we've covered lots of content related to value-added products and the value-added producer grant, something that I'll also be calling in this webinar today, the VAPG as its acronym. The goal of the entire series has been to help farmers refine and vet any value-added product ideas that they have and prepare for the next round of the USDA's value-added producer grant. You all are probably already familiar that this is a Zoom webinar, and so participants are automatically muted upon entry, but there are still several ways for you to participate throughout today's webinar. You can add questions to the Q&A box, comments or discussion responses in the chat, or raise your hand during the Q&A period at the end of the webinar, and I can unmute you. We're also recording this webinar. You should have received a little notification when you joined or when I started, and that's really to share this webinar with folks who are unable to attend. So we'll send a link of the webinar in an email at the end of this week, and you can also watch webinars 1 and 2 on CAFF's YouTube channel, which we'll drop the link to that in the chat. As I said, this is the last webinar in our series. Webinar 1 was 2 weeks ago, and webinar 2 was just last week. Today, you can expect to learn more about the VAPG application process, as well as some tips for submitting a well-scoring application. Ellen Rawley from Ellen Rawley Creative and Strategy is joining us today to share about her experience helping farmers write VAPG applications, as well as tips for submitting a well-scoring application. And so we're curious to hear from you whether or not you attended last week's webinar. So we're going to launch a poll in just a moment. You could just take a couple of moments to respond to that. That would help us out a lot. Understand where everyone's coming from today. All right.
That's about full completion. So on that.
Thanks, Kaylee. We've got most folks attended the last week's webinar, but some folks are new. So welcome if you're new. We have the webinar recordings on our CAFF YouTube channel, so definitely encourage you to check that out. Webinars 2, I mean, they're all meant to be watched together, all webinars 1 through 3, but webinar 2 and 3 specifically are about the value-added producer grant. So some of the information in last week's webinar, if you're here to learn more about the VAPG, could be especially helpful. So a note before we get started, all content for this webinar was created in collaboration with Ellen Rawley from Ellen Rawley Creative and Strategy. Ellen Rawley Creative and Strategy helps farms and food businesses launch and grow profitable product lines. Her go-to-market services include organic and food safety compliance, grant writing, and product strategy. And we're super excited for Ellen to join us today as our guest speaker. A little bit about Community Alliance with Family Farmers, also known as CAFF. We are a statewide organization, statewide to California, and we have staff located throughout the state that provide a number of services or offer a number of services to small to mid-scale size family farmers. We offer services related to wildfire resilience, small farm technology, food safety, connecting farmers with markets, helping farmers adopt and learn more about ecological farming practices. And then we also help raise farmer voices in Sacramento and Washington, D.C. through our policy advocacy program. We also host the annual California Small Farm Conference, which is taking place at the end of February, early March 2023. So definitely encourage you all to check that out. I think we'll be announcing the workshops for that conference very soon. So as I mentioned, my name is Grace Perry. I'm the Farmer Services Program Manager at CAFF, and you'll primarily be hearing from me during today's webinar. And then Kaylee Feiereisel, the Farmer Services Director at CAFF, will be helping answer questions, dropping links into the chat, and launching polls. And as we begin the final webinar, we want to name our main learning objectives so you all have a better idea of what to expect from the next half hour or hour and a half or so. After attending this webinar, you should be able to describe the application process for USDA's Value Added Producer Grant. Our guest, Ellen, will help identify elements of successful VAPG applications, which should help you assess whether your project is ready to apply for a VAPG. And then finally, we'll identify resources available to help support your VAPG application. And before we begin, I also wanted to cover or review what we covered in the first two webinars in case folks are new or want a refresher. In webinar 1, we introduced a key question to use to evaluate the viability of your value-added product. And the key questions were taught through the lens of the product development process, which is what you see on the slide here. The process includes creating your value-added product idea, determining feasibility, addressing development requirements, testing a small batch of your product, and deciding what scale to produce your product. In going through the process, we reviewed business basics, such as identifying your target market and competitors, identifying and calculating your cost of goods sold, operating expenses, and a competitor price comparison. And we also tested different price points to maintain a 50% margin in both retail and wholesale markets. We also reviewed food safety and food processing licenses necessary to safely produce value-added products and sell them in different markets. And finally, we discussed the importance of small batch product testing to collect feedback from customers about your product packaging, look, price, and taste, and using that data among other data points to decide on what scale to produce your product. Our guest speaker in webinar 1 was Marilee Olson from Preserve Farm Kitchens, a co-packer based in Sonoma County. And Marilee shared what it's like to work with a co-packer and advantages of value-added products for farmer businesses that she's seen over the years. In the second webinar, we dug into the details of the VAPG program and answered eligibility questions like what types of products are eligible, what types of entities are eligible, and what types of activities are eligible. We also identified the two types of VAPG grants, planning grants and working capital grants. Planning grants can be used to fund economic planning activities such as development of business and marketing plans and feasibility studies. Working capital grants, on the other hand, can be used to fund the operation of a value-added business venture, specifically to pay for eligible project expenses related to processing and or marketing of value-added products. We learned also that the VAPG requires applicants to match grant funds one-to-one with non-federal funds, meaning the applicants must come up with matching funds that are equal to the funds being applied for. Matching funds can come from cash or eligible in-kind contributions, and we went over some examples of those. There are some additional program requirements. For the applicant must produce and own over 50% of the raw commodity that makes up the value-added product that the application is being submitted for. And your application must prove that your product or the way you sell your product adds value to the marketplace. In webinar 2, we heard from Joanne Kruger of Little Apple Treats about their experience applying for and receiving a value-added producer grant. And so before we get into everything for this week's webinar, we do want to ask whether or not folks plan to submit a value-added producer grant application. So we'll go ahead and launch that poll now.
All right, thanks for people who have answered. We're gonna end the poll.
Looks like some solid yeses here, and then also some folks who are undecided. Hopefully with a little bit more information today, maybe you'll be more decided by the end of this. All right, and then a little disclaimer, because the information or the reference material for this webinar came from the information from the 2022 funding year. I just want to disclaim that some of the information from this webinar to the 2023 funding year might change. There usually are some small changes from year to year, and so just want to acknowledge that there could be some small changes to the application process. And so now we'll go ahead and get into the bulk of the material for this week's webinar. And so we'll start by doing an overview of the value-added producer grant application process. And so we'll really be reviewing the process at a high level and identify the steps that the USDA takes and steps that we recommend the applicants take. Steps initiated by the USDA are in gray boxes, and then the steps that are for applicants are in yellow boxes to help kind of differentiate between the two. And then this process isn't necessarily the formal process that's put forth by the USDA that is required of applicants, but rather our organization of the process in a way that prepares interested applicants for the submission of their application. So step one is that the USDA publishes a notice of solicitation of applications, also known as NOSA, and the Federal Registrar. And the NOSA announces the opening of applications, and eligible producers can start submitting grant applications once the NOSA is published. And then historically, the NOSA has been released between late December to late February each year, and usually applicants have either 60 up to 90 days to apply and submit their applications, but the number of days does vary by year. And step two, applicants begin mandatory registrations required for application submission. So applicants must obtain a unique entity identifier, also known as UEI number, and must also be registered and maintain registration in the System for Awards Management, also known as SAM. The process is typically pretty straightforward, but can take 2 to 5 weeks before a new SAM registration is active and valid. So steps 3 to 6 on the following slides are the way that we recommend people approach the application. Ellen has a program, which I think she'll talk about more during her presentation, where she walks applicants through the application process using these steps. But we did want to acknowledge that you don't have to do it this way, but it is a successful method that's been demonstrated through Ellen's experience with the grant. So in step 3, applicants should review and utilize the USDA's application toolkits, which are available for both planning grants and working capital grants and are available on the USDA's website. And using these toolkits will ensure that your application is complete. Step 4, applicants collect third-party research and documentation and write a work plan and budget to be able to complete the toolkit. In step 5, applicants ask rural development state representatives if they will review their budgets to help identify potential activities that could deem their application ineligible. And then in step 6, applicants write and finalize their application narratives within the toolkit. Applicants submit applications by the deadline. So again, depending on what the NOSA says, this is steps really 2 through 6 will be what you're working on up until up until the deadline, which again is somewhere between 60 to 90 days from when the grant opens. Applications can be emailed or submitted through the mail as well as online, and applications cannot be faxed. We have a couple of tips about submitting applications. Applications submitted via mail must be mailed to the state's rural development office in the state where the project will primarily take place. And then if you choose to submit your application electronically, it's recommended that you register for an account beforehand and try to file a few days ahead of time, because the application can be difficult to navigate if submitting at the last minute. You can imagine most folks are probably submitting at the last minute, and that's typically when the website glitches. And then in step 8, rural development state offices will review proposals for completeness and eligibility. In step 9, the state offices score proposals and send them to the USDA National Office. In step 10, the USDA National Office receives the proposals. And then in step 11, final scoring occurs by the USDA National Office. And then in step 12, awards are announced, which typically happens in the fall. Just for some context, this year, applicants were notified at the end of August 2022 about whether or not their applications had been awarded. So I did want to pause here since we just went over this process, and it's likely new for some of you. If anyone has any questions specifically about this process before we move on, and if not, we can definitely take questions about this at the end of the webinar. Let's see. Someone asked, I noticed there's also a big gap sometimes between award announcement and implementation. Ellen, I'm wondering if you could maybe shed some light on this.
Yeah, I'd love to. So there is a gap for sure between submitting your applications and then the announcement. They have been pretty consistent the last few years of announcing in October, which is awesome. But usually, that's kind of like 5, 6, 7 months after you submitted your application. Once you're notified, typically the onboarding process, you have some stuff to sign that will take 2 to 4 weeks, depending on how busy the USDA-RD department is. And then you have to start your project and submit a reimbursement within 90 days of signing that final paperwork. So you can have up to 3 years, depending on the type of application, to do your project. But you do have to start working on it within 90 days. You have to have something to submit to them for reimbursement within that time period.
Great. Thanks, Ellen. Mm-hmm. All right. So I'm going to move us on, seeing no more questions. And if there is a question and maybe you're still figuring out how you want to phrase it, then we'll come back to those at the end of the webinar. So before Ellen gets into more details about tips for applications, we have some here. So in addition to completing the required eligibility questions that are part of the application toolkit, which we reviewed last week, applicants also need to provide data and research to support the claims in their application. For example, data that demonstrates how their project will increase revenue and reach new markets. And so to answer the questions in the VAPG application toolkit, you need a cost of goods sold or competitor price comparison, sales projections, your strategy to meet those sales projections, a budget to carry out those strategies, and feasibility and market research. And so some of these were touched on in webinar 1. And so definitely encourage you all, if you haven't already watched that, to watch the full webinar to get some tips and instructions for how to go about completing some of those items. And then another note that some applications may also require a feasibility plan, business plan, and or marketing plan. So definitely pay attention to the type of application you're submitting and the application requirements to make sure that you're meeting those requirements. And so now we'll touch a little bit on how applications are scored. Honestly, we could probably spend an entire webinar dedicated to scoring. So we're just going to review scoring at a high level and then identify some resources where you can find out more information about scoring as you're writing your application. So as with most scores, the higher your score, the more competitive your grant will be. A maximum number of points that will be awarded to an application is 100, and the minimum score necessary to receive funding is 50 points. But the money is handed out from best scoring to least scoring applications until funding runs out. The application toolkit that I've referenced many times shows the number of points awarded to each category of the grant narrative. And the application toolkit also provides more information about how points will be assigned based on the quality of information provided in each category, which you could use to help guide your response to the questions in the application toolkit. So as an example, and this is something that's been condensed, but one of the categories is qualifications of project personnel. And these points will be awarded on a scale of 0 to 20 points, depending on the quality of information provided. So I've taken this directly from the application toolkit. So 0 points will be awarded if you do not address the criterion at all. 5 to 9 points will be awarded if all project personnel are identified, but do not demonstrate qualifications or experience relevant to the project. And then 15 to 20 points will be awarded if all personnel demonstrate strong, relevant credentials or experience and availability, indicating a high likelihood of project success. So you could imagine as you're writing your application, referencing how the application will be scored and making sure that you are, providing enough information to meet to be awarded the highest number of points. And so now that you know where to look for scoring information, definitely recommend that you review more on your own when the application toolkits are reviewed or released. And then some operations may also receive priority during the application scoring process. And so you might receive priority points if you're a beginning farmer or rancher, if you fall into the category socially disadvantaged farmer or rancher, if you are a small or medium-sized farm, veteran farmers or ranchers, ranches structured as a family farm, a farmer or rancher cooperative, and then those proposing a mid-tier value chain. So there are additional priority points related to the USDA administrative priorities that will be released in 2023 with the NOSA. And in most cases, USDA will assign the additional priority points automatically, but applicants may also be able to submit additional information to demonstrate that they qualify for priority points. So now I'm going to hand it over to Ellen to lend her years of expertise with the VAPG, and then we'll discuss opportunities to work with Ellen after her presentation, and then do a question and answer at the end of the webinar.
Thank you, Grace, so much. I am going to share my screen so we can switch presentations.
And I need to stop sharing, so I'll stop sharing here.
Okay. Just give us one moment. So I do this, that. And then, oops, I had to do that second. Little tech
Takes
break.
a little time.
There we go. Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today. Grace and Kaylee, it's been awesome working with you this first year on the VAPG scholarship, and everyone who is here today or going to watch later. It's just such a pleasure for me to do this part of my job. I love talking about this grant because I've seen over the past, I think it's 6 years that I've been writing this grant, how it can really get farmers the resources they need for that upfront capital to invest in these types of products and marketing and sales strategy to grow. And it's just fun to see what can happen when small farms actually have some extra money to play with and to work with. So what we're going to cover today, I'm going to give you a little bit more of an intro of the experience I have with this grant, just so you know who I am and why I'm speaking to you today. The importance of having a project plan, because that is really, to me, kind of the make or break where you start having a project that's eligible and something that you can work on now if you're interested on applying in this coming grant cycle. I'm going to walk you through my phased approach for writing grant proposals that get funded, and then give you some advice and key takeaways for each phase. So that includes time-saving tips, mistakes to avoid, basically all the things I've learned over the 6 crazy years of, the beginning years of staying up way into the night before grants were due, and all those things I've learned along the way to make this process way more enjoyable and also lead to funded applications. So just a note about me. So I'm the founder of what's become now Ellen Rawley Creative and Strategy Incorporated. I'm Ellen. I'm here in Petaluma. And my business really is because of this grant. Like, this grant is part of how my business developed. I was doing value-added production for a ranch here in Petaluma. I was their jam maker. I did all the production there, and also was developing beauty care products for them out of olive oil. And when I left that position, other farms knew the value-added work I had done and kind of approached me about this grant. They were interested in this grant and needed someone to write it for them. And I, as someone who's always excited to jump into something that I don't really know how to do and figure it out, said yes, and ended up in the process of writing that application for them. Both got funded, and I was lucky enough to also help project manage some of the projects that came out of it. So I saw firsthand what happened once that money came in, and how the project could kind of move them to a new phase of production and really sustainability within their farm. So over the years now, I've secured over $1 million in grant funding for small farms through this program. And that's in 7 states, so outside of California now as well. And people are selling through all different types of channels and have gotten products in different, you can see here, places that, are notable. But the real thing that's notable to me is that this grant does help farmers who are interested in selling more of their product, being able to feed more people, being able to make use of more of what they're growing, recovering things from the compost pile, if you will. And that's the part that to me is really the thing that stands out the most. So you can start envisioning if this product or this grant is right for you. I want to tell you a little bit about some of the clients who have gotten funded. So people have gotten funded that I've worked with that had less than $10,000 in sales, in total sales of their farm, to people who have over more than $1 million. Year 2 of farming to multi-generational farms, selling through farmers markets, farm stands, CSAs, local stores, grocery, and as an ingredient to food service or to other processors. Processing on farm or working with co-packers, from selling crushed tomatoes to apple cider caramels to dried rose petals to grass-fed hot dogs, organic coleslaw mix, organic grapefruits, sweet potato dog food treats, apple cider vinegar. It's a wide range of products. It's also produce sold in specific ways. And I think one thing that I want to definitely drive home is that if you're small, if you're diversified, this grant can still be good for you. You just have to fit within some of the requirements. And we're going to talk about that in this presentation. So let's go straight into it because I only have so much time today. So my first tip is it's only value added if it adds value. What do I mean by this? I'm going to give you an example. So in the last webinar, you had a chance to meet Joanne from Little Apple Treats. She was one of the first clients that first year that I worked with on a value-added producer grant. And at the time, this was their product. They make apple cider. They make products out of apples that they have an heirloom apple orchard. So they make granolas and shrubs and vinegars and also these apple cider caramels. And they wanted to go into grocery. They were doing great at farmers markets, and they had gotten into some specialty stores, but they really wanted to be able to move more volume without having to start going to farmers markets 5 days a week. So we started writing an application that was helping them get into grocery. But when I looked at the numbers, we realized that they were actually losing money on some of their wholesale sales because the cost of their product was high. Like most small farmers, you're talking about quality ingredients, you're talking about handmade products. Those things cost money. So how are we going to write a grant application asking for money to grow wholesale for this farm if they're losing money on wholesale? So that became really the focus of what I call the plan phase of working on this grant, which is making sure you have a product line that kind of makes sense that the USDA is going to want to invest in. So in this example, you can see the packaging they had. So the way this packaging works, it's one base that comes as a flat base that you have to construct. And then you have these different sleeves that go over those bases. What that allows you to do is you can save money because the bases work for all of your products. You can do a large batch of those. And then in this example, they had the same coloring across all, which I'm sure saved them money because the printer didn't have to change ink between the runs of packaging. So the packaging was something they could afford in their cash flow as a farm. But what we found when we looked into the numbers was actually the labor involved of constructing all this packaging was meaning that at the end of the day, when they were selling it on wholesale, they were actually losing money because the cost of people sitting there and having to fold all those bases is really high. Also, what we're finding at wholesale was buyers were only buying typically one product at a time. This is actually 3 different flavors of product, but you can't really see it from the eye because the packages look so similar. So a buyer wasn't really interested in making a display with multiple products because they all looked the same. And consumers going to the store also are going to probably only buy one instead of wanting to buy multiple because they each look different and a few of them entice them. So the real difference between selling at the farmer's market where you're there to explain everything, give them a sample of 3 different things versus on a shelf where really it's your packaging that's speaking for you. So what we realized in the plan phase was we had to work on this packaging. We had to come up with a solution if we were going to convince the USDA that it made sense for this farm to go and to expand into wholesale. So what we did through the grant is we ended up being able to fund this new type of packaging. So I need to change this photo because it only shows you one flavor. Each flavor has its own unique design. And so they ended up with like a really elevated, beautiful look, something that also looks really giftable. So makes them really popular in stores during the holiday season. people want to buy more than one because they each look distinct. They can tell that there's different flavors. Buyers can also tell that and want to create a display of multiple packaging. You can kind of see a different one here in this smaller picture from Martha Stewart. And what we realized is, moving to this kind of packaging, now they just had to open the box and fill it. Their labor cost went down. The cost of the packaging actually went down because with the grant, we were able to fund them purchasing thousands of units at a time. So we were able to, if you scale the amount of units of packaging you're purchasing, your per unit cost goes down dramatically. But most farms don't have that upfront cost for that first order of 5,000 units of a box. And that's where this grant comes in, because this grant can give you the capital for that first run that drops your costs. So now you're making better profit margins and you can afford the second purchase. So the grant covered things like packaging purchases, other ingredient costs, sell sheet design, professional photography. And Joanne herself said that that grant, the USDA value-added packaging grant that Ellen got for us, was critical in improving our branding, leading to a huge jump in sales and the ability to be picked up by larger accounts such as Italy, Oliver's, and Buy Right Markets. So this is just an example of how important it is to start with the plan and really dig into the numbers. Everything that Grace covered in the first webinar, we did that because really, if you need to have a functioning plan in order to write a grant that is then going to give the USDA that confidence that if they are going to invest in you, in a way, it's not, exactly that, but they want to see, if we put our money into this farm, is it going to pay off for the farm? And so you really have to start with that plan. If you want other examples of funded applications, you can go to my Instagram. It's here in the bottom of most of the screens. And I try to share lots of examples to help farms see what would be possible with this grant. Okay, so like I've been talking about, this is that phase 1 plan. So that's the real objective there, is defining a project worth funding. And that includes doing your cost of goods calculations, having a sales analysis, what has been selling, what has not been selling. If you present to the grant reviewers, a product lineup that isn't really selling, unless you have a very compelling reason of why this capital is going to help you sell it, it's obviously going to grow the sales, but you want to start with something that you've analyzed and feel confident that people do want this product. That includes market research and sales projections are all going to be part of what we do in the plan phase, because they become the building blocks of an application. And again, if you didn't see webinar 1, I definitely recommend going there, because Grace gave lots of good tips of how you go about doing these things. So that's phase 1. So I've kind of mentioned it a few times, this 5-phase approach that I use. And I'll mention the grant writing mentorship a bunch as I'm talking. So I just want to tell you what these things are so you're not confused. So I work one-on-one with folks writing this grant, and that has scholarships through CAFF. And then also I have a grant writing mentorship where I teach folks how to write the grant themselves. So these building blocks are how I work in both ways. And I am always really excited to share this part, because I've seen through the mentorship that if a farm really wants to put the time into writing this grant themselves, they can. All of the mentees that have submitted applications have gotten funded. So it is possible to do. It's just you have to really take the time to develop an application that is going to score well, as Grace mentioned. So let's go through those phases. So phase 1 was the plan. Now with phase 2, we're going to collect, then we're going to go into phase 3, which is budgeting. Phase 4 is writing, and phase 5 is submitting. So let me just give you a brief overview of what all of those are. So phase 2, in the collect phase, you're going to be collecting budget quotes because you need them to justify your budget. You're going to be collecting stellar letters of commitment, actual commitment. And both of those things you're going to collect to strengthen your application. In the budgeting phase, you're then going to be building an eligible budget, which is appropriately balanced, that won't limit you. So you want to make sure you have eligible budget items, which we'll talk about. You want to make sure it's appropriately balanced, so you have that one-to-one match between you and the grant funding. And then you want that, you don't want it to limit you in real life. You want to set it up so that you will always be able to ask for reimbursement for a purchase. So you don't want to end up in a situation where you're limited in cash flow because you can't ask for a reimbursement from the grant, from the USDA RD. In the write phase, you're going to then write a compelling narrative that scores well, and then submittal. So that's completing the application with all the required documents and submitting it by the due date. You'll notice I have the write phase all the way down at phase 4, which is one of the biggest takeaways from these 6 years, is that when you get an application toolkit, it feels really good to just start filling it out. You feel like you're getting things done. You're like, yep, that section complete, sounds good, awesome. But when you attack this grant that way, you end up having to revise so many times because you don't have a plan yet. You don't know the sales projections yet. You don't have a budget finalized, and it ends up just creating a lot of extra work and a lot of having to make sure you change that one number everywhere it appears in the grant, again and again and again. So definitely doing the writing last is one of the biggest pieces of advice I could give. So let's look at some takeaways from each of these phases. And I need to look at time. Cool. I'm going to go pretty fast here. So I just want to, before I get into these, I just want to say, okay, breathe for a moment. There's a lot of information here. And if you're not in actively writing your grant, I could see this kind of getting a bit overwhelming. So I just want to invite us all to trust that the pieces that stick out to you are things that are relevant to you right now. And that as you start writing this grant, if you choose to do that, you can come back and look at this and other parts of it will be relevant and those will then stick out to you. So any of this detail that just kind of feels overwhelming, I'd let it like wash over you and just focus on the parts that feel like they click right now. Okay. So phase 1 we talked about was plan. A really important piece is that this grant is connected to a commodity and a product. So you would, for example, be applying for tomatoes that you're going to sell as a tomato sauce, or tomatoes that you're selling as organic tomatoes, or tomatoes that you're selling as local tomatoes. Okay, so there's the commodity and then there's also the product. This grant can apply to people who grow 50 crops, but if you try to write the grant for 50 crops, it's not going to get funded. I've gotten very clear feedback from the USDA that they want to see 1 to 2 commodities and 1 to 2 products max. So if you are a diverse veggie farm, you really want to think about which one of these products that I'm making or want to make is going to be the focus of this grant application. And just know, any time that you're marketing yourself or doing sales, like if you're focusing on your organic tomato sauce, you are getting exposure for your whole farm. But the grant is not going to be able to be used to just generally promote your farm, your diversified organic vegetable farm. You have to narrow it down. Second, have some relevant sales data to draw from. So it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be 10 years of sales data. If it's just 3 months, that's great. If it's a similar product, so I worked with someone who wanted to do dried rose petals. We had sales of roses from those years, and we were able to do with market research, couch that enough to give enough credence to the sales numbers we were presenting. another person I worked with this year, they were selling someone else's vinegar in their farm stand, and now they were going to want to make and sell their own. So we could use the sales from that other person's vinegar. There needs to be something relevant that you can draw from. And think of this as writing a business plan for a bank loan. So it's very much a similar process as putting together a proposal that you're convincing someone this is a lucrative venture for you to give money to. And only spend your time on projects you plan to commit to. So this would, for many of the farms that I work with, this does narrow what they're going to be focusing on in the next few years down to a few products. Like that is going to be your focus of this grant application. And having a project that costs $100,000, that does take project management. That does take your time. So really make sure you're doing something that you are going to follow through on, because you have to report back to the USDA about how successful the grant is, how your sales changed or didn't change. You don't want to get into the situation where you've really shown no progress and then want to ask for another grant down the road. Okay, collect. I'm going to start going faster so we can get to some activities. So in the collect phase, you're getting stuff from outside folks. So leave enough time to do this. We leave at least 1 month in order to do this, because you have to send stuff out to folks and get it back. Your letters of commitment have to be actual commitment, not just generalized letters of support. So people have to be committing to sell your product or to help the project in some way. Using templates is a great way to do the letters of commitment, because then you're sending someone something they can edit and just sign, instead of asking them for just a general ask and then they have to take the time to figure out what it is that you need. And third-party research is really critical in scoring. So make sure your third-party research is credible. Then you'll go into budgeting. Only including eligible expenses is super important. If you have more than 10% ineligible expenses, your application won't get funded. So the biggest piece of advice is reaching out to your state rep and seeing if they'll review your budget before you submit it, because they will often do that and they'll check for ineligibility. Make sure when you're budgeting, though, to include enough people to pull the project off. Don't discount the time that what you're proposing is going to take. You need to have the time to actually do the steps involved in your project plan. And create a budget that will work within your cash flow. So just remember, you have to spend the money first, then you get it reimbursed. So if you only your budget gets broken down by task and item, and if you only have the grant funding going into a specific item, or you only have your funding going into a specific item, you can't ask for a reimbursement from the USDA RD if you put that item as being solely covered by your own contribution. So I always recommend that you split all of the expenses across both categories. If you're familiar with Excel, use Excel. Instead of the toolkit comes in Word and you're trying to do all these you're trying to do all these tables, and then you have to do all the math on your calculator. If you know Excel, let that help you, and then just move that stuff over. Writing, like I said, start writing last. Grace mentioned it too. Use the toolkit. The toolkit is really well laid out so that you get the most amount of points, that you cover all the pieces that they're asking. And so when it's just like, I don't know, for me, it was 5th grade. We learned how to do the 5-paragraph essays, I think, or no, it was 8th grade. I don't know. You had to do the 5-paragraph essay, and then your teacher would always say, okay, when you're done, reread the question. Did you answer every part of the question? It's exactly like that. Go back to their question when you're done writing. read it again. Did I answer every single part? Because that's how you're going to score well. That's how you're going to be between that you answered it, you addressed it, and that you addressed it well. That's like the difference here in the scoring. And don't shy away from presenting yourself in the best light. I feel like my mentees, this is always when I review their application, because I do a one-on-one review of all their applications. In the margins, I put my notes. Always. It's like the biggest thing, because they'll kind of they'll stay focused on something that didn't go right last year, or they won't really show what their farm has done so far. Like, this is just like going up and doing one of those pitches. You know, you're presenting with confidence why you feel like you can pull this project off. So don't assume that the USDA will know that. Don't assume that they'll trust you. Show them what you've done. Like, really, just your biggest courageous moment of being like, here's what we are, here's what we've done, here's what we can do, is how you should write this application. So lastly, I'll just leave you with the tip to start early and set aside the time needed. The mentees and the mentorship, so these are people who are fully doing the application themselves. I say that they should have about 80 to 120 hours to put together the application. You have 2 to 3 months. So I always say, like, plan for 5 to 10 hours a week. It does take time. So the mentorship, I just wanted to say for anyone who is interested. So if you've heard these, first we're going to do an activity. I jumped ahead. Okay. Do we still have time, Grace? Yeah, we have 6 minutes to do an activity, which I think is perfect. Okay.
Is that enough? Okay.
No, I think that's great. So I
All
wanted to do an activity with folks, and we're gonna vote on which one you would like to do. So we can do 3 different activities in the time that we have. So we can start looking at how to build a sales projection. We can talk about collecting strong letters of commitment and brainstorm who you can get those from, or we could start brainstorming your budget.
I launched the poll and some folks have started responding, so be sure to cast your vote for one of these. Looks like how to build a sales projection is gonna be the one. So
beautiful.
Yeah.
That is great, because the kind of one of the building blocks of the grant is having what they call a customer base and how that customer base is going to expand, and also having an income baseline and how that income is going to expand. So a sales projection is how you come up with those numbers. Okay, so I'm going to move my little thing. Building a sales projection. So there's really 2 main ways to do this. If you've been selling for a number of years, you can use your sales history to determine an annual percentage increase in sales and apply that to upcoming years. So if you look at your sales and you're like, oh, it looks like we've increased like 3% year over year, you can say, well, with the grant, we think we'd boost that to like 4 or 5%, you know, and that's how you can build a sales projection, like a slight increase off of something that you have proof of. Caveat with that, anything that's like really because of COVID fluctuations, just don't base a whole sales projection on the fact that you doubled sales of something in the year of COVID, if you were like doing home delivery. The second way is to make an educated guess about how many people will buy your product and how many they will purchase over a year. Either way, you're going to present these numbers, and then you're also going to present market research in your application that backs it up. So you're going to present your numbers, and then you're going to say, this is reasonable because we've done some market research, and according to these sources, the specialty food market grew this much, you know, actually grew 20% year over year over the last 3 years. Okay, that's how you'll do the actual argument. So we're going to focus on number 2, because I don't expect you in these 5 minutes to go collect your sales data from the last 5 years. So basically making an educated guess. We're going to follow kind of this, what are they called when you're like adding things and multiplying them?
A formula?
Formula, thank you. So we're going to follow this formula. In retail, it's basically how many units will I sell in a month times how many months will I have the product for sale per year times the retail price of 1 unit of product. That would be the income, for example. Wholesale, how many stores will I sell into in a year? How many cases of product will a store order in a year? Then how many units are in each case? And then what is the wholesale price of 1 unit? So that would get you an income goal. So let's break that down so that you can fill in the blanks. So for an example, for a farmer's market or a farm stand or online, here's how my brain would work. So I'd start by a customer baseline, and you can do a customer baseline really with my folks who sell at a farmer's market. Take a few weekends and actually start counting your customers, get some sort of count of, if you're a farmer's market, how many folks it seems like come in to your stand. It can be very crude, you can just pick an hour and kind of track customers and then multiply it over. This doesn't have to be like exact science, but you want some confidence in your numbers. So say I did that and I kind of figured out we have 400 customers a week and we're selling at the farmer's market for 48 weeks of the year. So in total, 19,200 customers are like coming in to our stand and buying something. 50% of them are regulars. So I don't want to count those people for every week because they're coming back every week. So actually it's only really 9,600 individual customers. So I think about 15% of those people will buy this product an average time of 4 times in a year. So how does that break down into the math? So I'm saying the 9,600 customers times 15% will buy 4 units a year. So that's 5,760 units per year. In a CSA, I might say I have 400 CSA members. I think about 25% of them will buy the product an average of 6 times per year. So this is a product that I'm like featuring as an add-on that they have to buy. So in that case, I'm saying we have 400 CSA customers, and then 25% of them are going to buy it times 6 units a year. So there's 600 units being sold in a year. Wholesale, I think I can get into 8 stores, and each store would buy 5 cases of product a month, and 12 units are in each case, and there are 12 months per year. So in that case, there's 8 stores, they're selling 5 units of product a month, there are 12 units in each case, and I'm saying they're going to buy every month. So it's 12 months. So 5,760 units per month. Okay. So let's do this for you. So take a second and fill in the blanks here. So you can see the actual, you can fill in the blank, and then you're also seeing the little multiplications or the equal signs to get you to an answer for each channel of your business. And I'm going to give you a few seconds. So if you have questions, you can stick them in the chat. Oops, I wanted to go to the chat.
I don't see any questions right now, Ellen.
Okay.
But definitely encourage folks to add any questions, and then we can get to them in the Q&A. Or if they're just quick questions now, we can also answer them now too.
Okay. Do you want me to keep going or leave folks a moment to do this?
I think keep going, and then we can come back to it at the end if there are specific questions.
Okay, so I'll leave you 1 second if you want to keep working on this while we're talking. You can take a screenshot of your screen right now and then have it open by you, and you can keep doing the math to build your sales projection. And that would be the basis of your baseline. So in this case, it would be the 400 customers is your baseline. Well, I shouldn't say that. The baseline gets a little more complicated, but this would give you a sales projection. This is what you're saying in units that you're going to be able to sell by doing this project. So I guess the last thing I'll just say, I wanted to bring this in, is that if in these webinars, you feel like you definitely want to do this, but you're not quite ready, I did decide this year to open the mentorship before the grant was announced. So basically you would get all the resources of the mentorship, which include all the resources for that plan phase of building your sales projections, of figuring out your cost of goods, all that stuff, with the hopes that if you are interested, you could get working on that stuff, and then you'd still be eligible for the scholarship. We could switch to working one-on-one, but part of the scholarship is an application. And in that application, we're looking to make sure that farms are ready for the grant and for the application process. So if you feel like you need a few steps to get there, you can reach out to us and see if maybe joining the mentorship for a few months would help you get to the stage where then we're ready to apply come the new year. You can find more information on that on my website, or you can also email projects@ellenrawley.com if you have questions about the grant or about this. And that will be it for me then, Grace.
Thank you so much, Ellen. That was fantastic.
You're welcome. It's always a pleasure.
All right, folks. So just a reminder, we're going to keep going. I have just a little bit left of a presentation to let you all know what is the CAFF VAPG application or VAPG scholarship program. So, and then we'll come back and we'll have a Q&A session with Ellen. So go ahead and put those questions into the Q&A or into the chat, and we can get to them at that point. I'm going to reshare my screen. Okay. Perfect. So before we get to the scholarship program, there are some things that that we've learned and that we've come to expect from the 2023 VAPG, just based on how things have gone in previous years. So the grant period opens typically early in the calendar year, between the end of December and the end of February. As I've said, and Ellen has said, applicants have between 60 to 90 days to write and submit their applications. And then we think that there's, a reason to expect it to be competitive. In 2022, the grant funds available totaled less than in previous years, which resulted in a more competitive grant cycle. And just for some additional context, the program received 342 eligible applicants requesting more than $54 million in 2022. And the $32 million of awarded funds went to 197 applicants with the highest scores. So a little over 55% of eligible applicants were awarded in 2022. CAFF will have up to 6 scholarships for farmers to work with Ellen Rawley on their value-added producer grant application, and this is through CAFF's VAPG scholarship program. So the first round of the scholarship program was in 2022, and so the 2023 scholarship program will reopen for farmers interested in applying for the 2023 value-added producer grant. The exact time is to be determined based on when the VAPG application period opens. And the program provides funding to work with Ellen to prepare a value-added producer grant application. So the way the scholarship works is that it provides up to 6 growers with $4,500 each in scholarship funds toward the cost of working with Ellen. And the farmers are responsible for providing $2,500 in their own funds, and those funds must be paid up front. So the total cost. So the scholarship program, provides the $4,500, and then the farmers are responsible for providing the remaining $2,500. And the pricing, the total cost of that is for applications only. So working with Ellen to write and submit an application, and not for a business plan or feasibility study that's required for larger applications. And Ellen, I guess a question here, these are open for both folks who want to submit a planning grant application and a working capital grant application. Is that correct?
Yes, people can do either. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, and so then we wanted to provide some information about what exactly it means to work with Ellen and what's included in the cost, because I think what I've learned over the past year of working with Ellen is that Ellen and her team provide way more than just, writing a grant application. It's really an opportunity to work one-on-one through a variety of ways. So there are 4 working meetings between Ellen and the applicant to keep the grant proposal process on track. Ellen and her team provide analysis of your product and your project, a recommended strategy for growth through the value-added producer grant, through projected cost of goods sold, production quantities and income, market research for strengthening grant arguments, budget creation, letters of commitment, those templates that Ellen mentioned to send for signature, support as growers collect the needed documentation, so budget valuation, letters of support, and signing up for those SAM and UEI numbers through the government website, and then preparation of a final value-added producer grant application for growers to submit. And then just an important note about that, even though Ellen has a phenomenal success record with the value-added producer grant, working with Ellen obviously doesn't necessarily guarantee that your project will receive funding. And so if you think that this scholarship is a good fit for you, something that you're interested in, there's kind of like a process that we go through for releasing the scholarship and the application. So we will, with Ellen, CAFF and Ellen will co-host a webinar announcing the scholarship program, and we'll open the application for the CAFF scholarship. And the application window will be pretty short, since the application window for the actual grant is also short, and we need to get folks started working with Ellen right away. I think in 2022, the application was open for less than 1 week. And so in the webinar announcing the scholarship program, we'll also release the application. Growers will be required to submit a short online application to be considered for the scholarship program. And the application process may also include a short phone interview. There's a tip for the application. It will be an online application, and the more details that you can provide in your application, the better it will help the folks assessing and evaluating the applications to understand your project and your product and your farm. So the more details you can provide, the better. And then scholarship recipients will be selected based on a set of criteria and notified of their award. And then onboarding with Ellen will begin shortly after folks have been notified of their scholarship, and then the remaining amount provided by growers to Ellen will be paid prior to starting work. So if you're interested in being notified about the scholarship program, we have a sign-up form for you all to be notified. And then if you aren't ready to apply for the scholarship program in 2023, you've just learned about the VAPG through this program and you need more time, we'll also run the program for a final time in 2024. And so regardless of if you participate in CAFF's value-added producer grant scholarship program, there are some steps that you can take before the 2023 request for proposal comes out. So you can sign up for the USDA Rural Development newsletter, which will send you updates about when the grant is released. You can sign up for your SAM and apply for your UEI number. And this process, as I mentioned, is pretty straightforward, but can take between 2 to 5 weeks before your registrations are valid. So this is something, though, that you can do before the grant is open. Close out your books so that you have a complete profit and loss at the end of 2022. Gather sales data to use in your application process. And many applicants work with grant writers like Ellen to help write their application. And so, you know, if you decide not to go for the scholarship program or for whatever reason, you should decide whether you want to hire a grant writer or write the application yourself. As Ellen mentioned, her mentorship program is also another option. And so start to reach out to grant writers before the application period opens. And just for some additional context of what working with a grant writer entails, our research shows that VAPG specific grant writers charge between $7,000 and $10,000 to complete applications, and sometimes ask for a percentage of awarded funds if the grant is awarded. And then just want to acknowledge this disclaimer again, that the information gathered for this presentation applies for the 2022 funding year, because that's what was available. And we do expect some small changes between funding years because that's typically how things go. And so we do hope that most of this content applies, but just a caveat that some of it might not. And we'll do our best to represent any changes at the overview webinar that we do once the grant opens. And then, as with all the webinars, we have some additional resources that can help on your value-added product journey. And you'll also be able to access these links in the PDF of the presentation that I send out after this webinar later this week. And so we have some evaluation questions via poll, and we really appreciate you answering these questions. It's 6 questions this week, and your evaluation helps us improve our programming year after year and also ensure that the grant funds that support our programming keep on coming. And so please just take a few moments to respond to the poll questions. And then we also have a feedback form if you want to enter some more lengthy feedback, some feedback that isn't captured in one of these questions that's launching into your screen now. So we'll give it a moment and then we'll go on to the Q&A. So we have about half of folks responding. So if you haven't already submitted your response, please go ahead and do that. It really helps us out to understand your experience and if anything can change, because we will be doing this webinar series again next year. All right. Thanks, folks, for those of you who participated. Okay, so now we can get to questions. And I see that there's a question in the chat, and Katrina asks, is there an update for the egg, poultry broth, freeze-dried products? I've been looking into this question about meat-based products since there have been the food licenses and processing requirements, mostly that we covered in webinar 1, are for raw fruits and vegetables, products made with raw fruits and vegetables. And so there's this question of where meat and dairy products fall in. And so it's a little tricky because there are different government agencies that regulate different types of products. So the USDA might regulate beef broth, where the FDA might regulate poultry broth. So it's confusing to go to different websites. And basically, I don't have a firm answer for you yet, Katrina. And that's because I'm trying to figure out what kind of exemptions exist, if any exemptions exist for these types of products for smaller scale operations, because sometimes they do. So I will definitely get back to you later this week. And I don't know if you have any follow-up questions, or Ellen, if you have anything to add that maybe I missed.
No, you covered it perfectly. It is a bit of the broth thing is a bit of a pickle. But it is, yeah. Anything that gets into USDA camp gets a little, it's not impossible, but it just, the standard is a little higher. So it's really determining where it would land.
Yeah. So if there are any questions for Ellen, encourage folks to pop them into the chat or the Q&A. I have a question, Ellen, I was curious about that we kind of went over an element of this last week and I didn't know the answer, but you mentioned in your presentation that Joanne of Little Apple Treats used a previous grant to pay for like packaging redesign. And it's my understanding that that's not allowed in working capital grants, but I was wondering if that's allowed in planning grants at all, if you can provide any.
So it gets a little bit tricky, but basically it's something that's different too. Like there was a time that packaging design was, I would write it into grants and it was an eligible expense. So that I took that off the slide, that the design was part of it, because I don't want to like trick people into it. That grant did fund that, but now I would not include that in the grant. So the packaging printing is still something that would be covered. So getting all of the packaging printed. Design can be part of a planning grant. Planning grants, yeah, design can be part of a planning grant. I've never done a planning grant that's all it was for. And that would be a question to follow up with the USDA about, like, can a planning grant not include the feasibility study and business plan? Can it just include things like design? But then the planning grant wouldn't then cover like the actual working capital of printing it. There have been folks who like already have a design, like, you know what the design is, you just have to get it put into the different formats that a printer needs to see. So that kind of work from a professional, like a consultant, like a design professional. Also, I've gotten covered in a working capital grant, but it's one of my little sticklers because I do think that design is a constant recurring expense working capital wise for any product-based business. So I don't know why they make that distinction, but they do at this point. But the thing I always say to folks too, just as a little follow-up to that, is if there's a specific thing, like a lot of people come, I'm sure this came up maybe in the webinar too, come for like, we want to build out this, or we want this piece of equipment, and that's not going to end up being eligible. They determine that. Another way to think about it though is, if this grant is covering things that are related to marketing and sales and your actual production staff, like right now, if you're paying your production staff out of pocket, and through this grant, you're going to be able to pay them only halfway because the grant is going to cover the other half of their wages, then can you use that money towards the things that are ineligible? So like, how do you think about it kind of as a more holistic approach of where does this free up the money for the other parts that you want to get funded.
Yeah, Joanne spoke to that and kind of gave an example of the way that that's played out in her operations. That was helpful.
I have to watch
And
it.
then Janine has a question here. Is it possible to form a group of family farmers for the purpose of lowering cost by engaging in a regional bulk purchase of a given packaging?
Is it possible to do that, or is there part of that that you want to get funded and that's what you're asking? Or is it just, you know, in general? I would say, yeah, it's great to do. If the question is like, can you do that? I've seen folks do that. I know how to do this legally. Well, I've seen people do it without like forming any sort of company that it's related to, by just like all going in on the purchase of things. It's a lot of like Granges. I feel like we're kind of in a way built up around that idea. But
Janine, I can unmute you and you can maybe clarify. I don't know if you mean if you can do it through the grant. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself, but you're welcome to.
I'll say, oh, nice. Setting up your microphone. Yeah, I've seen folks go in on purchases together just by someone doing the order and ordering for multiple people, and people pay the different portions of the order. I feel like the thing that sometimes is difficult about that is just the logistics of if you're getting things in pallets and then like getting getting things delivered to all the places that it has to go, and that the order frequency works for everybody. Has been what's been tricky about it in the cases that I've seen, but I've definitely seen people, especially with the cost of packaging now with jars and glass being so high.
The reason I'm asking is because I know that other kinds of organizations, like for example, a few town museums across a given county that has rather poor circumstances, want to all get together in order to purchase in bulk certain items that are otherwise very expensive. And I've run into difficulties because they have to create an actual organization. They can't just all decide to chip in, because otherwise they don't get the bulk discount. The company that manufactures the product or has it for sale in a warehouse does not want to offer that kind of a discount unless it is a recognized organization, in the same way that you don't get the for example, tax write-off.
Oh, yeah. So typically like wholesale sellers need to submit during the like onboarding process with working with a new vendor, they'll make sure that you're eligible. That's like a reseller's license or something it's called. It's like you have to have, and if someone else can chime in, because I'm blanking on.
A resale certificate.
Resale certificate.
Because yes,
one of
that was one of the great things about the grain system. But the grain system, just like the support system for dairy farmers, has gone through a lot of changes. And in some cases, you're constrained to either belong to an existing very powerful organization or you're out on your own.
Yeah. Typically, though, if you're like in the cases that I've seen where like a few processors or a few farmers come together, they have one of them at least has a resale certificate. So in the case of museums, like none of those organizations themselves might be the right type of organization to be able to access the wholesale pricing. But I haven't seen a wholesaler say, because you're going to split this up once we deliver to you, we won't do it. It's just as long as the person who's making the order has the required certificates.
Okay. So for example, one family farm that's doing a little bit better, maybe has more cattle on the ground, so to speak, and therefore already has some of the stuff, and they're willing to invite all of us under their umbrella, so to speak, in terms of the purchasing.
Oh, so you're not doing group purchases then? You're all just trying to do your own individual
No,
purchase?
no, but we would buy it as a bunch, and then we would divide it up. Like,
Divide it
you
up.
know, you go in and you do, and then you go into a bulk place, you buy everything, and you divide it up in the parking lot. That kind of thing. No. So I was just wondering, do you have to have an actual organization that you form, and what the legalities are? Because then not every state has the same rules about how one forms an organization.
Yeah, it sounds like, Janine, what you need is maybe a resale certificate. That sounds like what the wholesale buyer or company might be looking for. And so, yeah, I think
Right.
unless Ellen, you have anything else, I think that's maybe something to look for from someone in your cohort of folks, or someone that you might know, maybe
If a
less
bunch of
about
people have decided that they want to start making cheese, and they want to go to a wholesaler of products and service products for the manufacturing of cheese, we're going to have to look into how to form an organization that will allow us to become recognized with a reseller license, essentially. Okay. Thank you very much for clearing that up. They
Yeah,
don't
thanks
make
for
it
your
easy for
question.
small farmers. They really don't.
No, no, they don't. Thanks for your question. Ellen, one question I have, I don't see any others, but one question that I had, and maybe you can kind of expand on this, is like, when would you recommend, or I guess your tips that you went over, are those relevant for both planning grants and working capital grants? Because I know planning grants, you're pitching to the USDA that you need a feasibility study essentially done on some kind of product. And so, yeah, are the tips that you provided relevant for both planning grants and working capital grants? And maybe how someone would decide which one to go for?
Yeah. That's a good question. I feel like unless I went through and like reviewed each one before answering, I wouldn't want to like fully say yes or no. But I do think it brings up one point that's pertinent, which is a planning grant in a lot of ways is the same type of application as a working capital grant. You're still coming up with a customer baseline. You're still coming up with projections. It's a little odd to me because that's what you are paying you're applying for the money to pay for a professional to do that for you. But in some ways it's almost like you're preparing a mini pitch to give them some confidence that then having a third party come in and do this work is gonna then lead to an operation that there's a purpose to doing that. So a lot of the process ends up being the same. Like I bring planning grant people through the same 5 phases, because you still do the thing that gets really simplified is the budget, because usually the budget is just like paying this person for a feasibility study. And then we offset that with your cash and some of your in-kind. So mostly I'd say yes, it is still part of it. There was something you said at the end that I also wanted to address, but now I'm not remembering the second part of your question. That answer it fully?
Yeah, I think that answered it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. All right, folks, so we are just
I know what it was. Do you mind? So it was, how do people know like which one? You were like, if they're for which one? I'd say I wish more people were excited about planning grants, because what a planning grant will do is really, we're gonna do this process. If you're doing a working capital grant, you're gonna come up with a plan usually pretty quickly and like come up with a project, and you're gonna be capped by that $49,999, less than $50,000 if you don't have a feasibility study or business plan. The planning grant is really going to help you like have the time with a professional to go through like the 4, 6, 12-month process of like going through your numbers and coming up with like a really solid strategy for moving forward. That's why it's required for that larger amount of money, either a feasibility study or a business plan, which the business plan you can write yourself. But I feel like if you're either at a stage in your business that you're like, we're at a crossroads and we don't know what to do, and we need some outside reflection on what is the right next step, then a planning grant, if you have the money and time to put into it, I wish more people would take that year to plan before just jumping in. Or if you're someone who has that completely new idea, like if you're going for whatever they call it, not the market expansion, the other kind.
Emerging market.
Yeah, if you have an emerging market idea, you're going to need that feasibility study. So if you want to get it partially funded, that would be the other person who I definitely recommend the planning grant for.
Okay, great. Thanks for the clarification, Ellen. We are out of time, folks. So I want to thank you all so much for joining us today and joining us throughout the past 3 weeks. This is the final webinar of the series. And so you can expect to receive from us an email at the end of the week with a PDF of the presentation and a link to where you can watch a recording of the webinar. We appreciate your participation and your engagement over the past several weeks. So feel free to follow up with me if you have any questions. My email is just grace@caf.org. And that's really anytime, any question about this information that we covered, I can be reached there. So thank you all again. Thank you so much to Ellen for your time today and your time throughout this whole series. It's been a pleasure working with you, and Kaylee for holding down the chat and the polls. All right, well, we will see you all soon. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.